Candida albicans is an opportunistic fungal pathogen capable of rapid tissue invasion. In severely immunocompromised patients, these infections are aggressive and increasingly resistant to conventional azole and echinocandin therapies. Lactic acid bacteria, or LAB, are proven biological countermeasures that compete directly with Candida. However, administering live, replicating bacteria to a severely immunocompromised host carries an inherent risk of systemic infection. Researchers proposed a theoretically safe alternative, postbiotics. These are heat-inactivated bacterial remnants. In theory, dead bacterial structures and their retained metabolites offer therapeutic benefits without the capacity to replicate or cause infection. On paper, postbiotics offer a risk-free intervention for vulnerable populations. But proving their efficacy in a clinical pipeline relies entirely on standard laboratory measurements that, under specific conditions, produce mathematical fictions. This schematic outlines the foundational experimental setup. Researchers isolated a clinical oral strain of Candida albicans and challenged it through 3 distinct experimental branches: live LAB cells, heat-inactivated postbiotics, and isolated cell-free supernatants. This graph displays standard microplate assay results for postbiotics. At 8,500 micrograms per milliliter, the blue, yellow, and red bars demonstrate up to 95% fungal inhibition. In standard optical density-based assays, this rate is traditionally considered overwhelming quantitative proof of antimicrobial efficacy. But this graph reveals the results when that exact postbiotic concentration is tested in a live co-culture environment. The bars are flatlined, showing 0% fungal inhibition. The difference? The first assay measured optical density. This co-culture assay counted actual, viable colony-forming units. The microplate assay produced a massive 95% false positive. A spectrophotometric standard used globally to validate antimicrobial drug candidates completely misrepresented the biological reality of the treatment. To understand why the data contradicts itself so violently, we have to isolate the physical mechanics of optical density readings. A standard spectrophotometer shines a beam of light through a liquid sample. When billions of individual cells are evenly suspended in that liquid, they scatter the light. This lowers the transmittance reaching the sensor, which the machine reads as a high optical density or high cellular growth. Even after exposure to extreme heat and pressure, dead postbiotic bacteria retain sticky S-layer proteins on their cellular surface. When introduced to the suspension, these inert bacterial shells physically bind to the yeast cells, forming massive interspecies clumps. These aggregates alter the physics of the well. The heavy clumps either sink out of suspension or create large clear voids in the fluid. The machine's light beam passes cleanly through the wide fluid gaps uninterrupted, resulting in high light transmittance. The sensor accurately records low optical density, and the software translates that metric into high fungal inhibition. The hardware is completely unaware that the yeast is alive, dividing, and thriving tightly packed inside those clumps. Spectrophotometry measures bulk light scattering. It does not measure biological death. This makes the assay entirely blind to the physical phenomenon of interspecies coaggregation. These micrographs provide the physical proof of this optical illusion. In panels D, E, and F, you can clearly see the dark purple clusters of LAB postbiotic material, physically gripping the elongated fungal hyphae. This physical binding occurs because the surviving bacterial S-layer proteins interact directly with specific adhesins on the Candida cell wall, such as ALS3 and HWP1. The dead postbiotic material adheres aggressively to the yeast. But without active metabolism, these inert postbiotics cannot secrete the chemical compounds necessary to damage resilient fungal cells. Physical proximity is not a mechanism of action. Suppressing Candida requires an active chemical component that dead structures simply cannot provide. To observe that chemical component in isolation, researchers tested cell-free supernatants. This is the liquid medium in which the bacteria grew, rich in secreted organic acids, hydrogen peroxide, and bacteriocins, but stripped of all bacterial cells. This chart graphs the dose-dependent antifungal activity of those native, highly acidic supernatants. Look at the red bar on the left. Lactobacillus acidophilus supernatant achieved nearly 80% inhibition of fungal growth at 500 micrograms per millimeter. Now compare that to this chart, which measures the exact same supernatant after it has been neutralized to a physiological pH of 7. Notice the drastic drop in the red bar, which plummets to under 25% inhibition. This precipitous drop in efficacy comes down to the biophysics of the dissociation state of organic acids as they interact with the dense fungal lipid bilayer. At a severely low pH, lactic acid remains in an undissociated state. Because it carries no net electrical charge, it can pass seamlessly through the lipid bilayer, enter the fungal cell, acidify the cytoplasm, and destroy internal homeostasis. In a neutral pH environment, the acid dissociates. The molecules adopt a distinct electrical charge and violently bounce off the impermeable fungal membrane, leaving the yeast unharmed. The chemical warfare against Candida is strictly dictated by environmental pH. Without a sustained acidic environment, the bacterial metabolites are rendered biologically inert. Dead postbiotics provide physical binding, but lack the chemistry. Isolated supernatants provide the chemistry, but are neutralized by physiological pH. The only modality that solves both limitations is the living organism. This graph plots the viability of the Candida isolate when co-cultured with live Lactoplantibacillus plantarum. Look at the diverging lines at the 24-hour mark. The live probiotic drives a 2.39 log reduction, which equates to a 99% decrease in fungal viability. Unlike the optical density illusion, this data relies on the physical enumeration of viable colony-forming units. It represents genuine biological death of the pathogen. Live bacteria operate on a much faster generation time than yeast. They actively consume the available glucose in the environment, rapidly depleting the essential nutrients Candida requires to survive and proliferate. Live probiotics actively modify their niche, maintaining the chemical conditions required to suppress competitors. This efficacy stems from three overlapping mechanisms: physical exclusion, nutrient starvation, and localized acidification. It begins when the bacteria swarm the larger fungal cell. Using their sticky S-layer proteins, the live LAB physically co-aggregate with the yeast, blanketing the cell entirely to block its access to host tissue and adhesion sites. Once anchored directly to the fungus, they execute nutrient starvation. The rapidly dividing bacterial cluster aggressively outcompetes the yeast for local sugars, choking off its fuel supply. Finally, they initiate a localized pH crash. The live bacteria continuously metabolize those sugars into lactic acid, pumping it directly onto the fungal membrane. This creates a highly localized, highly acidic microenvironment. Because the bacteria are physically bound to the yeast, this continuous pumping ensures the lactic acid remains in its lethal, undissociated state, precisely at the point of contact, tearing through the fungal membrane before the broader environment can neutralize it. True antifungal efficacy requires the active, dynamic synergy of a living organism. Relying on isolated, bulk liquid measurements fundamentally blinds researchers to the complex, localized realities of microbial warfare.